Well, that was a very generous introduction. Of course, I wrote that. That's my bio. Um, I've never been to Ball State, and it's a pleasure to come because I've heard so much about it over the years, particularly from Steve Bedaines, who was a classmate of mine, and then later a colleague at the University of Washington. He's always raved about Ball State, and I have many friends here that go way back. Marv and Tony, of course, Joe and I go way back, and I just found out at lunch today that I had an exchange of correspondence with Dan Goodfin? Woodfin, many years ago, maybe 30 years ago, about solar architecture. And I've more recently met Wes Jans and Michelle and some others. It's a pleasure to be here. I've actually been to Indiana, though. I lived in Indiana. I went to junior high school at Wesleyan Junior High in Indianapolis. It's a feeder to North Central. Spent a couple years there. Played a little basketball, which I remember as being a sort of religion. And is it still a religion here? In fact, I remember Muncie Central going to the state championship a couple times. I think it was the biggest high school in the state at that point. It was gigantic. I want to drive by that later. It looms large in my sort of junior high school experience. I'm listed as a doctor, by the way, in the announcement. I'm not, like most of you, or probably all of you, I have a professional degree as my last degree, and I've come to academia from the design profession, first an architect and then a sort of urban designer. I haven't taken the scholarly or scientific track. I'm going to talk to you today about the suburbs to a large extent and some alternative ideas, but first I'm going to critique the suburbs in America, which I do in more detail in this book, Commonplace, which I'm going to leave for the library. And as Joe mentioned, there's another book coming out probably in June, which is a takeoff on this that takes it in some new directions. Can you hear me okay? Silent? Okay. So why don't we turn the lights down and look at some slides. Let's see, is this the laser pointer?
Yes.
Okay. I'll move out here. Am I doing this forward? Do I have to point it? On, off button. Here. Thanks. This is a city in Asia, Ahmedabad, India. This is essentially a map or a drawing of its public rights-of-way, a medieval city. This is Irvine, California. These two drawings are at the same scale. The difference, of course, being primarily the automobile. There are obviously cultural, historical, climatological, religious differences, but the difference in the sort of public realm, the network of circulation couldn't be more extreme. The first being pre-automobile, this being a sort of archetypical automobile-oriented city. In fact, if you ride stationary bikes at the gym, if you look, most of them are made in Irvine, California. Even the bicycles there stay indoors. This is a more typical grid, the American gridiron, which I'll extol the virtues of throughout this lecture. A very walkable city, somewhere in between Ahmedabad and Irvine. As you know, cities used to sort of structure themselves a little bit like the top half of this, with a center and generally agricultural and open space, separating it from satellites and small towns, rural villages, and so on. This is a paradigm that prevailed for a couple centuries at least. This idea of a continuous carpet of sprawl is in fact an aberration that's only appeared in the last 50 years, primarily in America. This is a map showing Baltimore, and this void here would be Washington. All the growth in yellow is prior to 1900. All the growth in red is after that. We have spread out very dramatically and quite quickly. In fact, in Seattle, which is a relatively dense metropolitan area, the developed land has gone up at a rate about twice of population growth. In Detroit, Metro Detroit, the population hasn't gone up that much, and the land area has gone up about tenfold. So many metropolitan areas are getting less dense very fast. Now, there are costs associated with this sort of low-density settlement. This top half accommodates the same number of households as the bottom. Obviously, the infrastructure costs are less in the top than the bottom. We own a lot of vehicles. Generally, the number that we own has gone up faster than the rate of population growth, and the miles we drive them has gone up. As you know, one-car garages have given way to two-car garages and now three-car garages. We love our vehicles. And in many ways, they are wonderful objects of beauty and objects of desire. Not so much the ownership of vehicles that's a problem, it's the number and length of trips that we take with them. And one of the reasons we take so many trips and so long trips is gasoline is so cheap. These are pretty old prices, but the point's the same. The black part of the bar is what it costs to get the gas to the pump, and the gray is the tax. And these aren't exactly impoverished nations here. They're paying a lot more. In fact, some of these are now paying $5 a gallon, and we, until what, 4 or 5 months ago, were at historical lows. I think gas last summer was cheaper in absolute dollars than any time in my life or your life. No, it's no wonder we don't drive a lot. I would argue we pay artificially cheap prices at the pump because these countries are, with their taxes, paying for things like cleaning up the air and cleaning up the rivers and cleaning up the oil spills, et cetera, et cetera. In some cases, they're using it for mass transit and other issues. We don't pay the full price at the pump, but that doesn't mean we don't pay it. We just pay it in our taxes to keep the fleet off the Straits of Hormuz or other geopolitical entanglements to keep stable supplies of oil. We pay for pollution cleanup, and in some cases roads and bridges and police and so on elsewhere. So we're sort of fooling ourselves. There is a remarkable correlation between density and gasoline consumption. The highest gas consumption, wouldn't surprise you, places like Houston, Phoenix, Detroit's very high too. And they're, of course, the lowest density. The densest city is New York. This is Metro New York. Manhattan and the inner boroughs are, of course, much denser than that. Toronto is the densest metropolitan area in North America by far. It's also the most diverse ethnically of any city in the world. Now, this cluster, a tight cluster of Australian cities, also low density, but because of better public transit, they have less gas consumption. European cities tend to be denser, much less gas consumption. Asian cities are, in many cases, off the chart. So this is not just an academic claim, this connection. This is measured, although I'm sure these numbers are out of date. I think the trends... Look at, this is a typical suburban community. Now, this is the energy pie. This is what architects are normally concerned with. HVAC, lighting, hot water, so on. In fact, I spent a lot of my career doing passive solar buildings that were shrinking that slice of the pie. And it's very important work, and I know a lot of it's been ongoing here at Ball State. But what I realized, and Peter Calthorpe and Don Prowler and Harrison Fraker and some others, was that, you know, this was the big consumer of energy, transportation. This being driving within the community and this driving outside the community. The amount of BTUs contained in the gas tanks of the cars was far greater than the amount of BTUs in the oil tanks for the furnaces. So we realized in some ways we might even been part of the problem by making solar efficient buildings, and I wish I'd brought a few slides. We were allowing people in some cases to live further out, have more cars, drive further, and we used to call it the solar shadow. To some extent, we were enabling people to lead more energy inefficient lives because of their auto dependence, which was a strange and painful thought. So air pollution's also an issue. It's not just energy consumption. Trucks, SUVs, cars do produce most of the air pollutants, most of the greenhouse gases in this country. And as you know, as a country, we produce, 5 to 8 times our share of greenhouse gases. Depending on who you read, it's a very high share. And by the way, we've always said, well, we produce a lot more, but if you look at, I don't have a chart for this, but if you look at greenhouse gas production, energy consumption, or whatever, not only on a per capita basis, but on a per GNP or production basis, we are nowhere near the best. We're not the worst, but we're about average. And by some measures, certainly pollution and energy consumption were the worst. Canada and the U.S. are right at the bottom of the list. And we're gonna pay for this at some point, not only in degradation of our own environments, but the rest of the world's not going to put up with this. We export a lot of pollution to the rest of the world, and people are beginning to speak from other parts of the world about our sort of cavalier attitudes. When an American is born, it has about 100 times the impact, ultimately on the environment as when an Indian is born. And we're of course all worried about population growth in the developing world, but in fact, the Americans are the one that are, on a per capita or per birth basis, the problem. It's pretty scary, and I think we're so close to it we don't realize it. Here's an interesting chart I just got a couple of weeks ago that shows that this connection of traffic and air pollution really is real, as is asthma. During the 96 Olympics in Atlanta, they reduced a whole lot of traffic and so on, and almost immediately traffic went down over 20%, air pollution went down over 25%, and asthma attacks over 40%. They of course immediately went back to the old mode afterwards, but this is, there are direct correlations here. And of course the water runoff from cities is huge. This is Seattle. The water is not only running off from all these streets, which are about 40% of the area of the typical American city, they're also running off from all the roofs, which are typically asphalt. The water pollution from general runoff is the greatest single source. You have far more pollution, not far more, you have more pollution coming from general runoff than from all the industrial plants in the United States or from agriculture. It's a huge water, literally, it's a giant drain. Let's face it, there's very little water going into the soil. And of course, flooding can be an issue as well. There's the sort of degradation of the landscape when we build our subdivisions further out and larger. This is a relatively benign one. They left some trees. As you know, though, it's often sort of clear the land entirely. The loss of habitat, the loss of open space, all that could be a whole other lecture. The social costs of sprawl are demonstrated in this interesting chart. This is a street with 2,000 vehicles a day. This is one with 16,000. This is a drawing of the social interaction along and across those two streets. As you can see, there's a lot more here. We do pay a penalty for traffic. By the way, this is not fair to criticize only suburbia for. This is true of cities as well. traffic does take its toll. Then there's an architectural cost, I would argue, that's associated with sprawl, although you'll find buildings like this in the city as well. But let's look at this column. This sort of the palette of architectural types is pretty anemic. This could be a house, it could be a garage, a muffler shop, it could be a church. It's not a particularly articulated architectural typology. It's more and more sort of big box space in which so many different things can happen. And it's sort of architectural entropy in a way. And also buildings designed to be seen through a windshield at 45 or 65 miles an hour tend to be designed more as cartoons. They look good from a distance. They don't reward a closer inspection. All the great architecture of the past, as you know, the closer you get to it, the more details revealed. You're rewarded at all the different scales. So, I mean, there are other costs of architectural, social, psychological costs of sprawl as well. I mean, who knows what the relationship is to crime and so on. I wouldn't want to posit anything there, but certainly there aren't many great works of art or great theater pieces or great dances that are about suburbia. There aren't even many postcards. I mean, it isn't a place that people necessarily are proud of. This is a street in Seattle, a 1910 to 1925 vintage neighborhood. And I lived on this street. In fact, I lived in slightly beyond this slide. After living in a very modern solar house I'd done in New Jersey, we bought an old house and fixed it up, and we lived on this street. We liked it, and it took me a while to figure out why. And almost all the floor plans in these houses are the same. They're basically center hall, or, you know, they're called Seattle boxes in many cases. 4 bedrooms on the second floor. They might have an attic with another bedroom or two, and ground floors are almost all the same. But the detailing is all completely different because each one was done by a different builder who lavished his attention and love in different ways on the buildings. It's a minor point, but it's interesting when you realize that a street like this, also in Seattle, with buildings like this, it's just the opposite. The floor plans are completely different. The sections are completely different. The sections, by the way, in the former street are almost identical. But the details are all the same. They have the same extruded aluminum windows, the same flush hollow core doors inside, the same Schlage doorknobs, probably Plymouth, the same overhead doors. It's interesting. It's a question of at what scale you want to be expressive. These are expressive at the scale of the plan and the section. The others were expressive more at the scale of the door, the window, the component, the detail. And I would argue, and will argue, that in urbanistic terms, the previous paradigm makes for better cities. Because these are all interesting buildings, but I don't believe, you may have your own opinion, I just don't think it's as coherent a street. Then there's this whole question of scale. As you know, the traffic engineers call the shots, and we get a typical landscape that looks like this rather than one that looks like this. This is a landscape of, by, and for automobiles. You'll see very few pedestrians. It's not very hospitable. I've seen it driving into Muncie. I've seen it driving into every city in America, and you wonder why we put up with it. Here, in fact, right here, this is a great sort of X-ray of the specialized landscape. This is in California, so we can take some cheap shots at it. But if you were to take many Indiana towns or Michigan towns and remove the trees, this same sort of zoning would prevail. There are two big differences between this and downtown Muncie or downtown Columbus or Indianapolis or Fort Wayne or Anderson or Crawfordsville or you name it. One is that the zones are single use. In fact, they're not all residential. This is all apartments. This is all housing, single family dwellings of one price range, another price range, another price range. This is shopping. This is institutional, high school probably. This is office park. It's all the constituent parts of a town, But rather than having them jumbled like they always have been, or relatively jumbled, they've been separated out into these very neat, distinct Cartesian zones, sometimes called Cartesian zoning or Euclidean zoning. That's one difference. What's another difference, I'll ask you, between this and a traditional town?
You have to use the car.
You do. It is almost entirely dependent on the car. Even people that will live in the same pod often drive. They certainly don't walk from here to here or any other place. Almost every trip, 11 per day per household, is done by the automobile in suburbia. It's a little better, and these people actually do a little bit better, or at least denser urban environments are down to 6 trips. But these people typically take 11 a day. It's a little misleading. That really is 5.5 round trips, the way trips are officially counted. Still a lot of trips. It's not so much the trips, though, Marv, I was thinking about. It's this circulation pattern. Can anyone comment on how it's different? Come on, you alumni. Are you getting CEUs for this, by the way? Yeah.
Two-way interactive, too.
All right.
Use the word pod.
Yeah.
Areas individually, its own little.
Right. Yeah. Right. They are separated, and they're also in super blocks. I mean, in a sense, that's one big block. And this is another big block, and that's another huge block. These super blocks mean that the roads are the grid, the network, is much coarser. The grain is much bigger, which may, it's a little bit the point of the first 2 slides. You could say, well, what's the difference? You blow the grid up, you shrink it. It's relative relationship. Well, it isn't relative. Just like it isn't relative thermally when you're doing a solar building. A small building and a large building it's not a linear progression. Structurally, thermally, luminous environment is linear, but not the other two. This isn't linear either, because what happens is you have so many vehicles on these arterials that at the intersections, which are the point of friction in the system, what happens? What's the difference between a red light here and in downtown Muncie?
Downtown Muncie is a complete waste of energy because the red light is on off and there are no cars there.
That's a good one. Well, the difference is you have a left turn lane, maybe 2, with a multi-phase signal. Well, that's been slowly driving you nuts. You probably didn't realize it. The green light is not green half the time. It's green maybe a third of the time, or even a quarter, because you have to wait and let this long stream of oncoming traffic turn left. Whereas if you have a grid that's much finer, you don't have to have those at every stop. It turns out turning left is the big problem in suburbia. That's the Achilles heel of any circulation system. And believe me, the red lights not only seem longer out here on 322, they are longer. They're a lot longer. And it's slow. I mean, I find just driving in those areas nightmarish, because I live downtown Ann Arbor and I'm used to a certain progression at the lights. I'm ready to go. Got to wait a lot longer. So there aren't enough places to turn left. There's Euclidean zoning, which means no walkability. And it's also sort of residual. You get a lot of, the open space typically is residual. They're not central parks. They're leftover open land. And then you've got the mall. It's again a very specialized environment. It's about retail. It may have a few other functions, but it's mainly about retail. And of course, nobody walks there. You have the biggest parking lot probably in the town. And it's designed for the biggest shopping day of the year, so most of the time it looks like this. It's not very filled. It's about consumption and nothing more, really. Although the walking street down the middle can be pleasant. It's all weather. There might even be a Christmas tree there at Christmas time and a choir singing. There might be people selling flowers or cookies or whatever, but don't be fooled. It is not Main Street. It's owned by one company. And they'll allow all sorts of community events to go on if they think it's going to improve their sales. It's not about building community, it's about building profits. And you can get kicked out, although some states, about half the states in the U.S. have ruled that certain constitutional rights prevail or obtain within the mall, although in some states they don't. For instance, if you're the Salvation Army or you're in some sort of political movement, try raising a little money in a mall, or try sleeping on a bench, or try, you name it. It's not, you check a lot of your constitutional rights. Now, it may be pleasant, particularly because you see people who are sort of the same class, but it's not, doesn't have that genuine social mix that you get on a main street, where you rub shoulders with everybody in the community, whether you like them or not. And I think it's important to rub shoulders with people you don't like. That's the lifeblood of a democracy. You have to know how the other half lives. You have to even become involved with them a bit, and it doesn't happen at a mall. In fact, if you're homeless, you won't last very long. You'll be kicked out. There was a guy kicked out for body odor in New Jersey from a mall, and he took it to court. He ultimately won, but it's not a true public realm. It could be. It could be owned by the town like a public market, and or at least the central walkway could be owned, and there could be daycare centers and other, libraries and offices, and there could be housing out here. It's not a morphological problem with the mall, it's more of a legal problem. The office park, same idea, specialized, all production. In this case, white collar, in other cases, manufacturing. It's another social desert. You'll eat in a cafeteria, you probably won't carpool because you're stuck here at lunch, et cetera, et cetera. More specialized space. By the way, the designers who do these different sectors are typically specialized architects. The bankers who fund them are specialized. They specialize in housing, or maybe even just apartment housing. They specialize in office parks, et cetera, et cetera. The contractors, highly specialized, which is efficient in some ways, but it doesn't add up to a city. Here's another monoculture. This is Las Vegas. Lots are a little smaller, and there are less cul-de-sacs, interestingly enough, but it's still very repetitive. And architectural types, one or two house types, maybe an apartment type or two, and a new type, the storage, somewhere I think, I think there's storage units somewhere on, I can't remember where, but there's a new type, the storage, what do they call them, storage centers, and what are they about? They're about consumption. I mean, we get, whatever. We buy so much stuff. We don't have room for it. We got to rent space to keep it. It's interesting that that's the new type that's emerged. So here's a traditional neighborhood. Here's a cul-de-sac, sprawling neighborhood. This is a grid. This is a tree or a dendritic system. A tree, a network, completely different in terms of circulation for vehicles and for cars. Here you almost always have to go out to the arterial to get from A to B. If you want to go from here to here, you always go to the arterial. Here there are many more routes. There's a center, there's a clearer edge. There might even be some institutional buildings, whereas all the commerce and all the institutional buildings are going to be on the arterials. Lots of cul-de-sacs. It's nice to live on a cul-de-sac. It's safe, but you bought that safety at the expense of the rest of the community, because what happens is there's a lot more traffic out here in this system than in that system, and there's more accidents as well. You're going to get a lot of traffic for the rest of your lives. I mean, we are in bed with the car, and we're going to have lots of traffic. Muncie may not have that much. Indianapolis probably does, but it'll get worse and worse. And frankly, it's a question of whether you want to have it distributed or whether you want to have it pile up. Here the traffic piles up where these collectors meet the arterials, and sometimes where arterials meet bigger arterials or freeways or whatever. Here there's just as much traffic, it's just distributed. There are more places to turn left. Every street gets some traffic. Here some streets get no traffic, and other streets get lots. You tell me which is more democratic and more egalitarian. It's about fair share. Communities need to take their fair share of traffic, just like they have to take their fair share of other social problems, or LULUs as they're called, locally unacceptable land uses. It's a classic American value is fair share, level playing field, etc. Here's another map of Irvine, not as extreme, but if you look at the network, you can see why it is so hard to get around. In that super block, there are 2 ways in and out. No wonder there isn't a lot of traffic there, and even more there. Better looking pattern. There's an architect, actually a spouse, who makes ties out of classic plans. I forget the name, in Boston. And the best looking ties are from suburbia. It's more like a paisley pattern. I mean, it really looks pretty interesting but on the ground, the grid is in fact often more interesting. Grid looks pretty boring at community meetings. It looks like a yawner, but as you know, grids are not boring at all. By the time you've built one out, there are lots of exceptions, and there's a lot of architectural variety. And these places actually can be quite boring because the architectural typology is very thin. So if I build X amount of roads, miles of roads, and put it in a network versus a hierarchy or a tree, turns out I can move more vehicles through that than I can through that, and the travel time is typically less than in that. Now, there's sometimes this has less travel time because you might have a long, clear run on a freeway or a major limited access road. But the amazing thing is that studies have shown that even if the travel time is shorter here than here, it seems longer. It's because you have more control over your itinerary. Even if it takes a little longer, you don't notice it. Whereas here, you do notice it. Here's another way to show this same difference between a network and a tree. Lots of people have drawn. Jane Jacobs was one of the first back in the 60s. Her book, The Life and Death, or Death and Life of Great American Cities, she pointed out that these long, narrow blocks in Midtown Manhattan didn't have many ways to get from A to B. The smaller blocks down where she lived had far more possible itineraries. It's so obvious that no one really, I think, had thought about it much, that the size of the grid does make, and the shape of the blocks does make a difference. So here's an alternative to all this sprawl I've been criticizing, developed by Peter Calthorpe, myself, and 3 or 4 other people. It's called a pedestrian pocket. It's now more often referred to as a TOD, a TOD, a transit-oriented development. But the pedestrian pocket was an embarrassingly simple idea developed in the sort of mid-'80s to late '80s. It had a main street with incrementally owned shops. It had some employment on that main street. It had a transit stop, preferably light rail, but it could be express bus. It had housing above the shops and senior housing right behind it. Had more parking, actually, than a typical old-fashioned Main Street. This is 2-level parking behind Main Street. Then it has low-rise, medium-density housing, typically townhouses, some apartments, and it has open space and some institutions like daycare and so on. What's different about it is that it's not allowed to grow much more than, we used to say a quarter mile, now we say 2,000 feet, because that's about as far as people want to walk on a routine basis to get a bus or to get a bottle of milk or a carton of milk or, go to a gym or whatever. So it's finite in size. It has a main street. It has transit. It's low-rise, medium density. It does have cars, though. All these units, believe it or not, are provided with 2 parking spaces. Again, it's not so much about the ownership of cars as it is about their use. Actually, the ownership of cars is more of a personal question now that I've never really thought about this. It's good for the national economy to buy, I guess, all those cars. And I guess it's good for the gasoline companies and insurance companies that drive them. But from a personal point of view, you can save about $600 a month if you can get by with 1 car. How many of you live in a household with 1 car? Anybody? You have to live in a walkable downtown neighborhood. We live in downtown Ann Arbor. We get by with 1 car. There are times my wife and I fight about who's going to get it, but we manage. And that was a conscious decision when we moved from Seattle. And they're real savings. And for a student, it's a huge saving. I bet a lot of your students, maybe most of them, drive. Okay, so here's some close-ups of these. These are pretty old drawings now. The transit stop. There is a sense of place at the center. Here, you have residential, you have office and retail, you have open space. All the parts are compacted here into a walkable environment that's transit served. Here's a more abstract diagram that hasn't been applied to a piece of land, so it looks pretty relentless, but it's to show the principles and the relationships and the sizes. This is employment, this is shopping, higher density senior housing, family housing, etc. So is it a gated community? Most definitely not. People think new urbanism, which this later sort of evolved into, is maybe sort of elite and gated. Well, there are examples of elite new urbanist developments, but they're totally against the charter, because the charter is all about mixing within the walls, which is exactly what medieval cities did. They had within their walls everybody from the richest to the poorest, from the bishop to the prince to the pauper. And by the way, they were tiny. That's a pedestrian pocket, a quarter mile by half mile. Carcassonne, France fits within it very well. Here's the Nike swoop, wherever that came from. So you've got, the point is, within these new urbanist communities, or neo-traditional or smart growth, you're meant to have a mix of ages, ethnicities, income groups, and land uses. So it's not like a gated community, which is all about one building type, typically, maybe even one architectural type, and one social type, etc. They're meant to be inclusive. And by connecting them up by buses and feeder buses and express buses and light rail and even heavy rail, you start to be able to take maybe 4 or 5 of those trips, 10 or 11 trips per day, by transit. There's still a whole network of automobiles in this system of roads. There's still people driving, but they're not driving as often and probably not as far. All right, here's an actual application. This is Northwest Landing outside of Tacoma. This is part of Puget Sound. This is Weyerhaeuser land, a very large piece of land, much too much for a single pedestrian pocket, or TOD. There's a sort of major, this is an existing little town. This is the sort of central development, but there are other little commercial centers. This has not been built out, but this is pretty well built out now. And they've sold about 1,000 units, I think, and there's some employment and so on. So how is it different from suburbia? Well, for one thing, it has a town center, a park, a corny little clock, but nonetheless, there is a center, and I'm sure these people were paid to come for the town photo, probably for a marketing brochure, but there is at least the opportunity here to do things in a publicly shared space. And these houses, which look pretty large in that grand American tradition of large houses across from parks and lining boulevards, they in fact are triplexes or quads. They're made to look bigger, but they're in fact very small. And notice there's no driveway. There's a planting strip, small front yard, a front porch. Fairly traditional architecture. We can talk about that later. But it works in a different way because there are alleys behind these units. Here's another part of Northwest Landing, and these are little starter houses, or maybe empty nester houses. They're on 2,000-foot lots. Many of our grandparents lived on lots of 2,000, 2,500 square feet with in a bungalow, one of the great American architectural types. Most communities, it's against the law to build on that size lot. You have to have 5,000, 10,000 square feet. These have small lots, but they all share a common, and in many cases they have alleys, and they're very inexpensive. Here they are. I can't quote the prices, but relative to that market, They're a real bargain, and they're selling very well. Notice they have the short face to the square, which means you can get more of them to line that open space. And these are selling very well. In fact, new urbanist communities in general cost more because people basically like them, and demand has tended to raise the prices. Here's a little bungalow. Again, it's important to remember that the short side of houses typically face the street in pre-World War II cities. It's only after World War II that the typical ranch house, and I know Indiana's full of them because we lived in a neighborhood full of them in Indianapolis, is the long faces to the street. Well, you add it up over the length of a block or two and you get a lot less houses, it's less walkable and so on. What's important about this house is not its architectural style, which is fairly trite, but the fact that it's got the short face. It has a porch, a small front yard, the picket fence, which is the sort of nemesis of new urbanism. You don't need that, but you notice you have a place for visitors to park, and you can plant trees, again, because the car's in the back. The porch may or may not work. I think they've been sort of overplayed. They're wonderful, but I'm not sure our lifestyles allow people to use porches as much as they used to. And I remember talking to the carpenters and the electricians that were working on buildings like this in Northwest Landing, and I asked them if they could afford to live here. And they said yes, they could afford this house, which is true of the American bungalow in the 20s. People who built them could afford to live in them. That's not true of most new subdivision housing in America. Okay, what do we do about investments we've already made in suburbia, like shopping malls? Here's a shopping mall south of San Francisco. Happens to be on a major freeway, which happens to have Caltrain, which is a commuter train in it. This is an office building, a giant supermarket, and lots of parking. This is what Calthorpe and Associates did with it. First of all, there's a station. They built a sort of dense street of townhouses with some shops, a school, some apartment houses, denser housing that slowly sort of disintegrates into, well, single-family housing, albeit on small lots. Supermarket stays. They, in fact, own this project. It's a completely different place, you will agree. And what's it look like? Well, these are the densest units. Not going to win any architectural awards, but these are townhouses. Again, visitor parking, planting strip, small front yard, a small porch in this case. Pretty dense, quite inexpensive. Here's some more. These are the larger, the more, I think these are single family, or I'm not sure if these are tech. But again, collective, shared playgrounds and parks. Transit. Well, you need a certain amount of density. We all know to make this pay for itself. This happens to be Portland, the sort of poster child of smart growth, where they have invested in transit, and it's done rather handsomely. They never pay for themselves. You should realize all those great transit systems in Europe that you may have visited, they're all subsidized. But so is the car. The car is subsidized, as I talked about earlier. You don't pay at the pump for the true cost, the total cost of all the externalities of driving a car. It probably doesn't even, the gas tax probably doesn't even pay for the roads and bridges completely. But there are lots of other costs as well. So yes, it's subsidized, but all transportation is subsidized. Airlines are subsidized. And by the way, they all have about the same, a full airplane and a full bus have about the same energy consumption per passenger mile. It's the empty airplanes and buses that are a problem. And empty cars, of course, the worst of all by far. If you were to take a cross-section of America at commuting time, say 8 o'clock, there's so many single occupancy vehicles, SOVs, in America that you could fit the entire population of Western Europe in those cars with the driver. That's how much empty capacity there is. Okay, sorry. This is a new rail line that goes from central Portland out to Beaverton. And it's important to see each of these little TODs, the larger ones are on it, but then there's smaller TODs that are connected by feeder buses. So you can live there, you can walk, you can take a bus, and you can take a train. Walkability is you need 4 things for walkability. You need destinations worth walking to, and they typically are at the center of these. You need the density of people, the sort of compact pattern development, so there are enough people to support those destinations, enough people within walking distance. You need a pleasant scale. You need safety. It can't be dominated by the automobile. It's got to have a nice human quality about it. And lastly, and maybe least obviously, you need transit, because otherwise you're doomed to walk in one of these little pods. Without transit, you can't enjoy the whole region. But with transit, you can. So transit and walkability go hand in hand, which you know if you've been to cities abroad. There's also an urban growth boundary around Portland, which is a great way to contain sprawl. It doesn't solve all the problems. It doesn't say anything about the quality of the buildings within the urban growth boundary, but it certainly is a sort of noose around Portland, and sure enough, it's grown a lot less in area as its population has gone up than, say, Seattle or Indianapolis. Here's the way a typical interstate at a cloverleaf intersection is developed. These sort of office parks and shopping centers. Why not develop them something like this, where there is a mixed-use, walkable town? People might even live there as well, but at least they'll shop and work there, and some of their trips can be eliminated, and you have a lot less impact on the land. Suburbia not only has sort of strangled a lot of cities, and in many cases killed the inner town, particularly when there are Walmarts and big boxes like that. That'll kill a downtown pretty quickly, as you know. It's true you get a lot of cheap goods there and a lot of choice as a consumer or a shopper, but as a citizen, you give up a lot. You often sell your town down the river. And Walmart knows exactly what they're doing. They'll do a slightly larger one a little further out in about 5 years after they typically do the first one. They know exactly what they're about. They are about stealing business from all the locally owned, historically rooted buildings, shop owners. Then suburbia comes in and starts to invade the city. This is downtown Ann Arbor, and here's a drive-in bank. I mean, why would there be a drive-in bank downtown? It's not the right. It's a confusion that many American cities, particularly smaller ones, suffer from. Here's one of the grand avenues in Detroit, once lined by these traditional apartment houses and modernist houses, nice shops. And look what's happened. It's not only a house, it's a house whose garage faces this grand spoke, one of the 5 great boulevards in a city that was once 2 million people. I mean, it's really urbanism turned inside out. Suburbia not only has strangled downtown Detroit and sort of emptied it out and hollowed it out, then it comes back in and does things like this that ultimately are not sustainable, not very urban, and it's a second-rate version of suburbia. I mean, it's not good urbanism, it's not even good suburbanism. Places like this, all throughout Detroit, they're not very urban, they're not very walkable. Driving is a wonderful freedom. We see it in ads all the time. I love to drive. I love cars. The American male between ages 15 and 20 can name about 40 colors in food groups and fruits and about 120 vehicle names. I mean, it's a big, big part of our culture, and we might as well accept that. But we don't I think Americans are ready for fewer and shorter trips and less traffic. It doesn't mean we have to give up the automobile. We can use it like we did when we were kids, or the Sunday drive. It used to be an amenity, not so much a necessity. Pedestrians don't have a chance. As you know, this happens to be in London, but in America, well, this is from a famous movie, Jacques Tati. Pedestrians might be frustrated, but at least, it's a much livelier world when people are mixing on a sidewalk, even with vehicles. It's a genuine public realm. It's much more egalitarian and democratic and so on. And it can be pretty bleak, even in Europe. This is in Holland. If you look at all the apparatus and all the sort of paraphernalia and so on, it's not very, as I said earlier, hospitable to the human body as compared to a traditional street like this in Amsterdam, or a public market like this in Rome, or these steps in Rome, or this Faneuil Hall marketplace in Boston. And then there's the bike, which is just a great way to get around. I don't know, is there much biking in Muncie? Yeah, it's a really efficient way to move around. It's safe. I know it appears to be dangerous, but in fact, driving is more dangerous. It turns out that all the people that left the inner city because they were worried about crime and wanted their kids to escape it actually put their kids in greater danger. The suburbs, on average, are more dangerous to live in than the inner city. That's on average. There are probably certain blocks in Chicago, New York, and Detroit that are more dangerous than certain blocks in suburbia. But on average, it's more dangerous. And that is because people drive a lot further and they drive a lot faster. And that causes a lot more injury and a lot more death than crime. And the bike, of course, is a healthy way as well, as an efficient and clean way to move around. Walking is the best of all, though. It's fun, it's clean, it's cheap, it's healthy, it's safe, etc. So I think I've gone on long enough. I just pulled these out. These are some drawings I did about 25 years ago that are in a way about the same idea. This was the sort of model, the house, which now would have 3 cars probably here, but the big yard, the swimming pool, the sort of unused front yard, maybe flamingos, etc. Versus this model, which is a productive use of the land, wind, sun, solar greenhouses, tram walls, direct gate, other solar devices, bread box, preheaters, so on. It's a completely different attitude. And it's as much about the party wall as it is about the tram wall, as Marvin has heard me say too many times. The party wall is maybe the most powerful idea of all because it saves energy, it's cheaper to build, and it also means higher densities. But none of the densities I've shown today are really high density. They're median density. In fact, they're low density by world standards. But they are higher density than what we've become accustomed to in America. I think I'm going to end it there, because haven't we used up about an hour? It feels like it. How long, Joe, have I gone? I could go on a little, or are there questions? Do you want to, or do you want me just to shut up and sit down? Well, I do actually, but it's a okay. New urbanism is a movement that has interested me. I'm actually interested and proud of a lot of it. I'm really embarrassed and bothered by a lot of it too. I don't think the architecture has been worthy, but I think the urban design principles are important. And I think we've learned a lot from it, although like all movements, including the solar movement, which I was involved in, they tend to get co-opted over time. And that will probably happen in this case as well. But I think there are important messages embedded in it, most of which I've tried to give you today. There are other urbanisms, though, that I talk about in my new book. There's everyday urbanism and post-urbanism, which I see as the 3 main models. There's also the sort of conventional development that's going on out there, which I wouldn't call, it's not really a disciplined position. It just is what happens by default. You might call that market urbanism. And as you know, that's changing the face. That's to a large extent what I've been talking about. Market urbanism is really changing suburbia. It's even changing our downtowns. Downtown Philadelphia, all the great office buildings are now being converted into hotels. And as you know, the city is becoming more and more an entertainment center, sports, cultural, etc., which is okay, I think. But it's a sort of willy-nilly change that's driven by the market. The market's often a genius. The market's a true genius at establishing price, but the market's not so good at recognizing externalities, the total true cost of a given action. And so I'm not sure the market urbanism that is making exciting downtowns is necessarily in the long-term interest of the country or the world. But nonetheless, there's that. There's new urbanism, which I just talked about, and I used to think that was sort of an extreme. There was new urbanism and there was post-urbanism. Post-urbanism is, of course, what all the students love, and that's why they're not here today probably. They're probably drawing on their board something that's sort of post-urbanist. It's, you know, deconstruction, it's Frank Gehry, it's Hadid, it's Eisenman, it's Libeskind, it's all about, it's Rem Koolhaas to a large extent. It's all about doing individual buildings, most of which have given up hope on any idea of a shared, true urbanism. In fact, Koolhaas says urbanism is no longer possible. Forget it. He says between the escalator, air conditioner, and sheetrock, it's all over. It's just basically junk space is the term he uses. And there are others. I mean, they've given up. They're all about individual signature architectures. They're not really about a whole greater than the sum of its parts. I used to think those were the two sort of antipodes or polarities, but now I realize new urbanism is actually in the middle. You got post-urbanism. What's on the other extreme is everyday urbanism, which doesn't care much about form at all. It's much more about sort of grassroots development. The planning department at our college very much embraces this. It's also a little bit based on the Venturi, Scott Brown model of pop culture and pop art. You know, Main Street's almost all right, the arterial strip's almost all right, Las Vegas, learning from it, and so on. And it is true that at night, the strip can be pretty nice, although we should realize that the photograph can really fool us. The camera lens, which here collapses it, makes it look even more exciting and interesting. Indeed, you can make, with a camera, even a suburban parking lot look pretty good. But when you're actually out there, it's pretty empty. So at night it's pretty good, but in the day it's really pretty bleak. In many cases, obviously, you can take photos that look better or worse. But everyday urbanism doesn't embrace this literally, but it's a lot less ambitious and utopian than new urbanism. Here's a plan out of a charrette we did a couple years ago in Detroit, and I would call it everyday urbanism. Because, I mean, there's no big formal idea. It's much more about sort of grassroots development. It's informal. It doesn't have the sort of grander vision that new urbanism has. But it's very much about empowering people. It's very citizen oriented. I mean, it's a very positive social and in some cases ecological movement, but I don't think it necessarily makes for beautiful cities. It does make for more vibrant and more egalitarian and more equitable cities. And I'm not against it. In fact, I have a lot of everyday urbanists who I like and respect and so on. I don't think it's really at odds with new urbanism. It's just more relevant in certain cities. I mean, in many cases, the third world cities can only be talking about sort of this urbanism. I think some American cities are ready, though, for new urbanism, a little bit like they were for City Beautiful, which in 20, 30 years turned many American cities of total squalor into places of significant civic beauty. I think that could happen again. But in many other places like Detroit, everyday urbanism might be more appropriate. Here's another drawing from that charrette, which is about an automobile repair area, sales area. It's a messier but a very vital sort of urbanism that's sort of bottom up. Post-urbanism, though, I'm not so sympathetic to. It actually relishes and champions the sort of edge city, placelessness. Rem Koolhaas loves Atlanta. At least he says he loves it, but he doesn't live there, of course. He probably lives in a traditional townhouse in Amsterdam or something. This is typical of post-urbanism. It's theoretically very exciting. It's all based on flux and movement and a sort of futurist approach. It actually appreciates the sort of terrible, terrifying, swift beauty of 19th and 20th century infrastructure and industry. And it really is about this new world of placelessness. It's about movement. It's not about traditional place or traditional city. It's about the excitement, the dynamism of what some cities have become. And it is exciting, no doubt about it, as a place to shop or visit or recreate, maybe even work. But I don't think it's such a great place to live. In fact, if you look where the dot-commers live or the post-urbanists, they don't live in places like this at all. Their plans always look sexy and interesting from the air, but on the ground, they're often empty and windswept. The whole the whole sort of ethic of it is different. It's about excitement and titillation and breaking the rules and shocking people and so on. Not that this is particularly shocking, but and then there's this whole computer-driven world, which is so exciting on the one hand, but so tyrannical on another. Just because the technology's there, we feel we have to use it, and there are just so many possibilities that, I mean, this is nothing we can ignore by any means. In fact, I'm impressed how wired you are in this building. You're actually ahead of us, but we're investing more and more in things like rapid prototyping and 3D printers and so on and so forth, which can be very liberating, but it can also be very irresponsible, particularly if you start with this. So I just caution us about post-urbanism, which is exciting, but not necessarily responsible or economical or sustainable or whatever. So again, I think this sort of middle course, which has room. The interesting thing about new urbanism, there's room for foreground, honorific, public, monumental buildings that are designed by, Herzog and de Meuron, or pick your favorite architect. But it puts them in a bigger context. It's part of a system. They only do the important public buildings. They don't do the neighborhoods. They don't do the planning. And there's room for everyday urbanism as well in parts of the city, and in some cities, the whole area. It's a much more of a balanced position, which is what I like about it. I mean, there's room for everybody, whereas you'll see actually in some of these other paradigms, there's room only for one style, one ethic, one approach. So I think we'll end it on that. Thank you.